There was a young deaf couple, and they were just so excited to have gotten married, and they were looking at each other, and they said, "Hey, let's go to a motel." So they said, "Sure, let's do," and they drove for a long, long time before they found one. They finally saw a sign that said motel, and they were glad to see it, but it didn't have a sign as to whether or not there was a vacancy. So they pulled over, and it was a very large motel, 3 stories. They looked at each other and they wondered, and the wife said, "Hey, I'll go check and see if we can get a room at the office." So she got out of the car and went into the office, and the husband sat in the car impatiently waiting for the longest time. He wondered what had gone wrong, and then he realized, you know what, she'd found the room, and it was somewhere in that motel, but she had thought he'd follow, and she hadn't told him which room it was in. So he finally got an idea, and he leaned on that horn until he made such a loud noise that all the lights in the whole motel went on in every room except for one, and he knew that was their room. What happened was, I went on a trip. I traveled with a group of people who chartered a ship, a cruise ship, that was only for deaf people. There were 1,100 deaf people all together on that cruise ship, and they trained the staff of the ship in sign language and how to work with deaf people. They trained everyone all the way up to the captain, so that the cruise became a deaf boat, a deaf cruise ship. I decided to go along and have a great time. I had mixed feelings about it, however, because I had recently become a widow and I didn't know if it was a good idea. I talked to my son, and he said, "Hey, go for it, but be sure to look for a rich man." I asked my daughter what she thought, and she said, "Hey, I'll pay for it. Go and have a great time." So I saw an advertisement that said they needed entertainers, and I applied and got a position as a member of the staff. There were 100 of us altogether, staff members, for 1,000 deaf people. Out of that 100, 50 of us were deaf people, and the other 50 were interpreters, and we worked together as a team. We had all kinds of activities that we organized, like talent shows and games such as the Newlywed Game that got people talking to each other and signing, and all the hearing and deaf people were able to communicate and get together. We saw thousands of people signing. There were 1,000 pairs of hands moving around on that ship. When people laughed when I was telling my jokes on the cruise, it made me feel great. If I saw people on the stage telling sad stories, I'd look at the audience and they'd have these sad faces and frowns. When I told my jokes, people laughed their heads off, and it really made me feel great. There was a little old lady, and she decided she wanted to buy some plants. She wanted 4 plants for her windowsill. So she went to the nursery and told the nurseryman that she would like 4 plants. Nice ones, if you please. So he went and got a tray and put the plants in them. She thought they were great, and he said, "You know, every morning you need to water these plants, and at the same time you need to tell each of them good morning." She thanked him for his advice and went home and put them on her windowsill in just the place she'd planned. Monday morning came along, and she did exactly as he said. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. She did that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then on Friday she did it again. Good morning, good morning, good morning. But the 4th plant was wilted. She couldn't figure out what was wrong, so she picked up that plant and took it back to the nursery and showed it to the nurseryman and asked him why it was so wilted. He took it to the lab and checked it out and came back and said to her, "I'm sorry to tell you, but this plant is deaf. Now, I happen to know sign language, and so I'm going to show you the sign for good morning." The woman said thank you very much and took her plant home. She put it back in its place, and on Monday, she watered the plants and said, "Good morning, good morning, good morning," and then she signed good morning to the 4th plant, and it stood right up. It's so interesting how different deaf jokes are from hearing jokes. You notice when somebody tells a hearing joke, the whole hearing audience laughs, but nobody deaf laughs, and vice versa. When a deaf joke is told, hearing people don't laugh, but deaf people do. Well, you see, hearing jokes have humor that's based on sound, whereas deaf jokes have humor that's based on the visual aspect. So let me give you a good example. This is a hearing joke. In Los Angeles, there's tremendously heavy smog. You can hardly see through the smog. But once it was all gone, and U-C-L-A. Hearing people laugh and laugh at that joke, and deaf people can't figure it out at all. And the reason is because U, the letter U, sounds just like the word you, the person. And C sounds like the thought of seeing something. And L-A is Los Angeles, so it sounds like UCLA. But deaf people look at that and say, the University of California, Los Angeles? What's so funny about that? That's the visual side versus the auditory side. Now let's look at a deaf joke. This is a joke about King Kong. He climbed up the Empire State Building in New York City, and then he climbed back down and walked around New York down Broadway. And here were all these little people, small as ants, down below him, running away in tremendous fear. But he was just having a grand old time looking at the tall city buildings. And he saw this beautiful woman backing away from him in terrible fright. And he picked her up. And she was wriggling and screaming and trying to get away. And he said, "Oh, are you beautiful? What a figure! I wish we could get married!" And smashed her with the sign married. And the deaf people laugh and laugh at that joke, but hearing people can't figure it out. You see, the sign to get married smashed her. Many hearing people simply don't use American Sign Language, ASL. They prefer to use selected signs in English order, which is called signing exact English in some cases. For hearing people, that might be good, but for deaf people, it's tremendously difficult for them. Putting in signs for every word in every piece of a sentence is laborious at best. Let me give you an example. If one were signing in exact English, I went to the store, one would have to sign all the pieces that show the past tense marker and to and the and all of that. But in American Sign Language, two signs efficiently carry that same meaning, therefore saving eye strain. Whereas the signed English version has so many little pieces that the eyes are exhausted. It's so difficult to see what the meaning is. It's time-consuming and really troublesome. Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of controversy about this because deaf people were trained to be passive and not to assert themselves and not to assert their rights. Hearing people traditionally decided for them everything about their lives, including the fact that they would use signing exact English or whatever, because it would be better for them, that they use better language. They didn't feel that deaf people's English skills were good. You know, it's a sort of American attitude that when you come to America, you need to know English, and therefore, American Sign Language was not adequate, not a language that was adequate to hearing people. But now, deaf people are learning how to, in fact, assert themselves. And they're saying to the hearing world, we have our own sign language, and we can use this ourselves to communicate more effectively, and it's a better language for us. Now, this controversy continues and continues between the hearing and deaf worlds. My family didn't use sign language. In those years, the attitude toward sign language was terrible. It was considered an embarrassment and degrading. So we were not allowed to use sign language in our home or among my mother's family or friends. If I used sign language, I had to do it in dark corners with deaf people in secret. But when I came home, I kept my hands quite silent. So I'd go off and have a great time signing and come home and never sign at all. It was sort of schizophrenic lifestyle. I was born in 1927 in Chicago on a beautiful day, May 21st. A fat, healthy baby, very, very cute. And there was an epidemic of diphtheria, And I, in fact, contracted diphtheria and went in the hospital at 7 months. And I stayed in the hospital for quite some time, and when I got well and came home, I was at home and a nurse lived upstairs from us, and she noticed something different about me from my brothers. She told my mother that she thought I couldn't hear. My mother said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Watch this," and clapped, and my brother looked around, but I didn't react at all. I just kept doing whatever I was doing. So my mother called the family doctor, and in fact, the doctor said they'd better take me to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota. So we went there, and I was thoroughly examined by the doctors, and the result of that was that the doctors had a conference in which they told my parents the results of their examination. They said that I was deaf, no brain damage, nothing of that sort, that I was fine in every other way, but that I should be sent to school right away to avoid any fallback in school, but also that I should be very careful not to go to any quack doctors. My mother didn't know what to do, and they said, well, since she was from Chicago, that she should go to the school board and ask about a school for the deaf in Chicago. My mother did that, went to the school board and asked them, and didn't know what to do. The school board said not a problem. They had a school in Chicago called the Alexander Graham Bell School for the Deaf. So my mother went to that school and talked with the principal. The principal was displeased with my age. I was far too young. I was 2 or 3 years old. And that school admitted students over the age of 6, not at that young age. But my mother said, I have to send her to school. And he said, well, we'll give it a try, but I'm not sure it'll work. I stayed in that school for 1 semester, and it didn't work out indeed. The teachers didn't like me because I wet my pants and I cried all the time, and I was so confused. So my mother searched and searched for another school, but she couldn't find a school that admitted me so young. Finally, she found a school. It was in St. Louis, and it was called the Central Institute for the Deaf. They said they would admit me, even though I was very young, and my mother was so pleasantly surprised after a long search. The only disappointment was the distance between St. Louis and Chicago, but she decided to let me go there anyway. But before I went, my mother knew she was going to miss me, and so she had this photograph taken of me. At Central Institute for the Deaf, I learned to speak and read lips, and this was how we communicated, through speech and lip reading. When I was at school in St. Louis, it was, as I told you, a boarding school, and I cried my eyes out. So therefore, my parents were not permitted to see me throughout the year, except at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and summer vacation. That was the only times. But one time, my father came to see me anyway. He went to the principal, and the principal brought me to my father. And I was shy. I didn't feel comfortable with my father. He felt a stranger to me. Another time, I had the chicken pox, and so I was put in the infirmary. My mother heard that I was sick, and so she took the train from Chicago to St. Louis, and she went to the principal and said, I've come to see my daughter. And the principal said, I'm sorry, you can't see your daughter. It would be too difficult on the nurses. If you see your daughter, and if she sees you, she'll cry and weep and make a big fuss. So my mother had to go right home without ever seeing me at the school. It was a very difficult time. Every summer I would go home and I would think of all kinds of schemes for avoiding going back to that school. One summer, I told my mother, I'm not happy in this school. I cry all the time. I want to stay here with you like my brothers who don't go away to school. My mother said, do you want to be smart? I said, yes. She said, well, then go back to school. Well, that scheme didn't work. The next summer, I thought of another scheme, and I said to my mother that the dorm supervisor spanked me all the time, and I didn't like it. And my mother said, hey, if you stay home, I'll spank you all the time just the same. Well, that one didn't work either, so I was sent back to school. And I stayed at that boarding school for 6 years. It was such an unhappy childhood. When I was young, I thought everyone was deaf, just like I was. And therefore, it seemed logical that I would be forced to lip read and speak, even though it was very difficult. But when I got older, I discovered that it was me uniquely who was deaf and that many people weren't, and I was really grief-stricken. In fact, I went through all the emotions, grief and anger and depression, before accepting the fact that I was deaf. You know, deaf people who didn't know how to sign, when we hung out together, when we communicated with each other, we lip-read and used gestures to communicate, gross gestures usually. But then, when I met deaf people who signed, in those days, I was a teenager. And I was maybe 15, 16, 17 years old, and I ran into deaf people who signed. They had a finger alphabet that they used and signs that they used, and it was fabulous. It was so much more fun, and there was so much less misunderstanding that would happen. When I joined the deaf community, I enjoyed it so much, I knew that I had found my people. It was still mischievous for me to sign because at home it wasn't allowed, so I still had to sign in dark corners. But I learned sign. Really, I picked up all my signs from the street. So at first I learned the signs for dirty words, and, then later I learned more. But people made fun of me because I signed things strangely or didn't use the right sign at the right time and that kind of thing. Nonetheless, we got along. And I joined the drama club, and I joined that club so that I could improve my signing skills. When I was little, during my formative years, in elementary school, I was in a school for the deaf. But in high school, I went to a hearing high school. My mother felt that a hearing high school would be better for me. I didn't have interpreters, so I had to rely on textbooks and pick up what I could. Then when it was time for me to go to college, I wasn't allowed to go to Gallaudet University, the only liberal arts university for deaf students, because my mother was afraid I would lose my speech skills and my lip-reading abilities. So she forced me to go to a hearing college. I thought, well, since I'd made it in a hearing high school, perhaps I could make it in a hearing college as well. So I entered DePaul University. But after a year, I really didn't make a go of it. It was really difficult. Eventually, I did go to the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. I went there to take courses in teaching deaf children. I got my degree, and then I got my teaching credential, and I felt very happy with that. But I got my degree at the age of 55. Then I was ready for marriage. I wanted to get married because I had failed to make it through college. I hadn't made a go of my college career, and I really wanted to find myself successful at something, so I thought maybe at marriage. I had 5 criteria in mind for a husband. First of all, I wanted him to be a good companion, a good conversationalist. Secondly, to be from a really good, nice family background like my own. Thirdly, I wanted him to have a beautiful name. I hated my maiden name. And fourthly, I wanted us to share the same religion. And finally, to not have any members in his family who were deaf. I looked around, and indeed I met Philip. And he was of the same religion, and wow, was he a wonderful conversationalist. I thought about those 2 things, and then I visited his family, and they were really nice. They were from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And such a nice family. I loved his parents, and they were Jewish. He was good company. There were so many good qualities. I fell in love with him. I thought I would flirt with him, and indeed our relationship grew. We talked over things, and we had a lot in common. He had been raised in a school that was oral like I had, but he also had native American Sign Language skills. He had a beautiful last name, Zola, Compare that to my last name before I was married, Lipschutz. I didn't like that name at all. I flirted with him. He liked me. I don't know if he'd fallen in love yet, but we definitely liked each other, and he took me out on a date. We were out on the dance floor, and he happened to mention his deaf sister. Well, that really bothered me. And he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Oh, nothing, nothing." And then I said, "Oh, you have a deaf sister. Where is she?" And he answered that she was a teacher in Arizona. And he kept asking me what was wrong, but I didn't answer him. And so I sat, and after he left, I thought about all the good things. He had a good family. He was Jewish. He was a good conversationalist. But he had a deaf person in his family. Should I drop him? And I thought, oh, well, 4 out of 5 ain't bad. When Philip and I got married, my parents planned the entire wedding. We had 700 guests, and my mother wouldn't allow any deaf people among our wedding guests. She didn't want any signing there. I'll tell you, I didn't entirely care because I had my man and I was so happy. But Philip felt pretty uncomfortable. He couldn't understand why deaf people weren't allowed at his own wedding. He went along with it, but he was a pretty sad bridegroom. I was happy but felt uncomfortable with all those people and not understanding what the rabbi said, trying to lip read his Hebrew and everything. And then there was an opera singer who sang 2 arias at our wedding. And here were my husband and I in the midst of the crowd, watching her mouth move, while 700 people watched us as if we were monkeys in a zoo. It was very uncomfortable. As I think back on the early years, after my husband and I were married, we had 2 children, a boy and then a girl. Our son's name is Fred, and our daughter's name is Sue Carol, and they were just adorable, and I taught them how to sign. I taught them how to count, and they looked so darling with their tiny little hands. And then it just so happens that my mother came from Chicago to Milwaukee, and my children went and signed to her. And my mother said, "Don't you sign, don't you dare." And I was shocked. But I thought to myself, well, I don't want to confuse my children, and so I decided to let it go. I did that for the sake of peace in the family. So from that point on, my children didn't learn sign language. Now I have a grandson, and I know that my son wants my grandson Matthew to learn sign language while he's a little boy. I think my son regrets missing that in his youth. And I want to communicate with my grandson. This is difficult because I'm the only deaf member of my family, and it's important for him to practice, and that's difficult. So I thought, well, the best solution would be for me to go to my grandson Matthew's school. There, I teach a sign language class to his classmates, and to him, of course. I bring in books, workbooks, of the manual alphabet, some workbooks with animals in them, and show them the signs for those animals. He and his classmates have a lot of fun learning signing. And then I sign a story, and all of them really enjoy that very much. I'd like to continue that and hope that perhaps Matthew will remember some of the signs. Since we don't see each other often enough to practice, it's not clear that he will, but we'll go ahead and give it a try and see what happens in the future. It's possible that Matthew will have the interest and the motivation to sign, and he might not, but either way, it's all right. I like to enhance my storytelling skills. I've performed them with wigs and makeup and costumes to become the 3 pigs and the wolf with a wolf's nose and Little Red Riding Hood with a cape and the way that I act and the 3 bears and Goldilocks. And through this medium, I express my feelings and read the stories and turn them into lots of fun. You know, actually, I became a teacher by accident. And teaching was the best career of my life. I really enjoyed it. I didn't know that I would be talented at it. I thought I'd be good at sales, but teaching as well, that was a joy. I taught in an elementary school for 13 years. And then an interpreter training program was established, and I applied for a position there and got it. And that was an enriching experience. I found I was able to contribute a great deal of knowledge and skills to the people who wanted to become interpreters. You know, in those days, deaf people didn't have a great deal of confidence in interpreters. They were worried about being misunderstood, but they've built a better relationship and closed the gap between interpreters and deaf people a little better. Because after all, deaf people do need interpreters. We need them for this educational setting, courtroom, medical setting. So it's very important that we build confidence in the interpreter. But for that, we've had to teach technical vocabulary and so forth. But I'll tell you, I've sure enjoyed my experiences teaching and training interpreters. Philip and I moved out to California to follow our children. We have a son in San Francisco and a daughter in Los Angeles. And my husband was a senior citizen. So I decided to be with him and go to the Deaf Senior Citizens Club. What beautiful people! And we attended a convention, the California Association of the Deaf Convention. And there I became very aware of deaf senior citizens with not much to do. They weren't particularly interested in the political meetings and so forth. So I decided to pull together a program for deaf senior citizens. We planned entertainment and a special program for the senior citizens. The National Association of the Deaf has a special section for senior citizens. So we decided to form a similar section at the state level to establish good programs for deaf senior citizens, to see what kinds of services need to be offered for them. And that was quite a success. Recently, I went to Georgia and helped them to form another state senior citizens section. The senior citizens there were so happy. They felt that I inspired them to feel young again. Instead of feeling like old people assigned to their rocking chair. No, now they felt young again. You know, we're having a senior citizens boom. We have a baby boom, but we're also having a senior citizens boom because of all the increased medical services and better services for deaf senior citizens. So now there are lots of deaf senior citizens all over the country, and we're pulling together to enjoy ourselves and do whatever we can and want to. We even give performances. We tell stories about our youth. Now, I want to tell you, senior citizens can sign a little differently. After all, some have arthritis and so forth, but that's okay. Now I'd like to tell you one more joke. There were 3 men, a Russian, a Cuban, and a deaf man, on a train sitting in a compartment. And as the train moved along, the Russian became thirsty, and so he pulled down his valise and pulled out a bottle of vodka. He drank a lot of vodka and then passed it around. No one wanted any, so he had his fill and then opened the window and chucked out the bottle of vodka. The other 2 in the compartment looked at him and said, "Why did you throw out a perfectly good bottle of vodka?" And the Russian said, "Hey, we got plenty of vodka in Russia." Well, then the Cuban pulled out a cigar, a nice big Havana cigar, and began smoking it. And pretty soon the compartment filled with smoke, and the Cuban looked around and opened the window and threw out the cigar. The other 2 said, "Why did you throw out that expensive cigar? You hadn't even finished it." He said, "Hey, we got plenty of cigars in Cuba." Well, as they passed the time on the train, some people started passing by the compartment, and the deaf man noticed a a conductor walking past. He reached out, grabbed the conductor, and threw him out the window. And the two other passengers in the compartment said, "Oh my God, why did you throw out that conductor?" And the deaf man said, "Hey, we got plenty of hearing people."